All right, great. Thank you, Jose, for getting us started. And Jody and Candace, thank you. No problem, Jose. Thanks for letting us know. We appreciate you taking the time. I know you all are really busy. Welcome, Kevin. Welcome, Ron and Tom. Welcome, Mitchell. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. So thank you all so much for being here. We are really excited about today's session where we will be talking about instructional scaffolding. We know it's a topic that is particularly important this year, and so we're excited to dive in. If you haven't already done so, please just take a moment to share in the chat your name, district, and role so that we have a sense for who is in the room. So that you have a sense for who we are, we wanted to just introduce some of the facilitators from TNTP. My name is Katie Buckland, and I'm a director here at TNTP. I am located in Boston, so not far from some of you. And the other facilitator today is Irene Teskey, and I'll allow her to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Irene Teskey and I am based in the Bay Area. I'm a senior manager here at TNTP and I'm so glad to be here with you all today. I'm seeing some familiar faces from our previous sessions, so welcome everyone.
Great, thank you, Irene. You'll also see a few other TNTP staff members here who will be supporting with the session, particularly in breakout rooms. So we have Margaret Bruce, Donna Anderson Davis, Greg Leap, Paul Schwinn, and Jacob Michaelman. So feel free to ask them questions and they'll be, as I said, supporting in breakout rooms. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to the third session of our Drop-In School Leader PD. And this is a learning series that focuses on learning acceleration. And today we'll be focusing on how we can accelerate learning through strong instructional scaffolds for Tier 1 instruction. So before we dive into our learning for today, we'll spend a few minutes just orienting ourselves to how we'll spend our time together this afternoon. As you may already know, DESE and TNTP have partnered on learning acceleration. And earlier this year, we created the acceleration roadmaps to provide guidance and recommendations to educators around 3 overarching priorities for accelerating learning this school year. These 3 priorities, you are likely familiar with them, but they are here on the slide. And today, our learning will highlight critical practices around the 3rd priority, which is to ensure strong grade-appropriate instruction with just-in-time scaffolds where they are needed. So before we dive in, we wanted to just thank you all for making the time during your busy day and busy week to be present with us. We know that it is not easy to shut your office door and kind of pause on being fully present with your schools to participate. So we thank you for being here. And speaking of being fully present, we know that it can be tempting to just sign on and just listen, but we always like to remind participants that we strive for high engagement during our sessions. And so today you'll be asked to join breakouts and share your reflections and questions. So again, thank you in advance for fully engaging with our learning community today. In addition to being present, we have a few additional values and shared norms that we'd like to embrace today. So please take a moment to read the ones in yellow here on the slide and just chat the one that you'd like to keep front of mind today. Great. Know better, do better. Curiosity. Teaching practice, not perfection. That is a great one. A couple folks have said that. Great. Joy and humor. Yes, thank you for elevating that. Know better, do better. Great. Thank you all for sharing those norms in the chat. And finally, before we move on, I just wanted to note that Margaret Bruce from TNTP is here to answer any private questions that come up. So feel free to just send a private message to her if you have any questions related to the content or the tech, and she will make sure to get you an answer. All right. And so with that, here are our objectives for today. And I'd love for a few of my TNTP colleagues to just read these objectives. Could I ask Irene if you could take the first two objectives, and Greg, if you wouldn't mind reading the last one.
Sure. So explain how learning acceleration supports students with diverse learning needs. And then we'll internalize a best practice for intentionally planning scaffolding strategies according to content area, learning context, and students' needs.
We'll also examine how to anticipate and plan for potential barriers to learning by designing flexible lessons and learning environments that address the needs of historically marginalized students.
Great, thank you, Irene and Greg. Go ahead and just put in the chat, which of these objectives are you most curious about? You can put 1, 2, or 3, depending on the objective that you are most curious about and most excited to learn about. Great, thank you, Linda and Matt, for getting us started. Great, great, lots of 2s, absolutely. I think 2 and 3, yep. Great, great. So we will spend, this is great because we are going to spend the most time today on strategies 2 and 3, but we just want to start also by explaining how learning acceleration supports students with diverse learning needs, just to ground ourselves in what learning acceleration is and how it supports students with learning and thinking differences. And so with that, I will hand it over to Irene to pick this section up.
Great, thanks, Katie. And I just want to add on, I know people come for 2 and 3, and like Katie said, this is part of our grounding with starting here and a common understanding. But I also want to highlight that everything you see today is going to be shared with you and is meant to be as turnkey as possible for you to use back at your school with your teachers. So even if some of the information is familiar, you might pick up different language to use, especially with teachers who might be a little bit more hesitant or resistant to adopt the practices we talk about today. So let's go ahead and get started with our first objective. So by now you've likely heard a considerable amount about the importance of using instructional practices that will accelerate learning as opposed to practices that focus on remediation. Recently, however, we're finding that while teachers are generally on board with learning acceleration as a concept and an approach to instruction, there is some hesitation around if this approach is effective or necessary for all students, particularly students who are significantly behind, students who have IEPs, who are learning English, and who have other unique needs. And to answer this question about who acceleration is for, we're going to look at some recent findings from TNTP's most recent research report. But before that, we're going to take a step back and look at acceleration with fresh eyes. And we'd like for you to take a look at this expanded definition and comparison of acceleration remediation. You may have seen this before and may recall it from the acceleration roadmap that Desi has shared. And as you look closely at this chart, I'd like you to think about what is something that is standing out to you that is a critical distinction that you may have not considered before today, or something that you think is often overlooked. And so as you're thinking about that and noticing these critical distinctions, please share your thoughts in the chat. Great, I see some ideas coming through. Great, thank you for all of those ideas you've shared in the chat. It's really important that we continue to come back to what these definitions mean as we're refining our understanding. Some of the ones that I see coming through are a lot about prior knowledge and accessing that prior knowledge and building schema. These are some things we've talked about in our previous session, so I definitely encourage you to check out some of those resources if those are concepts that maybe you hadn't previously associated with acceleration, or your teachers are not maybe accessing at this point. So let's go back to take a little bit of a closer look at, again, like we're saying, who acceleration is for. So in our newest research paper released in partnership with CERN, we focused on the efficacy of these two approaches and what we can uncover about how to most efficiently and equitably support unfinished learning for all students. And in the study, which you can find on our website, we found that students who are academically behind their peers benefit tremendously from accelerated learning practices, just like the ones we're saying of building prior, accessing prior knowledge and building schema. They benefit tremendously from using these practices as a way of accessing grade level work. We also found that students who experienced learning acceleration struggled less and learned more than students who started at the same level but experienced remediation instead. Part of the reason for this is that with accelerated learning practices, students are receiving instruction that is tailored to only address what is necessary to master the grade level content that's being focused on in that moment in time. So in other words, their learning is contextualized and instructional time is maximized and used efficiently and intentionally. What we found also reaffirmed our findings from our other report, the opportunity myth, around which students do and do not receive the opportunity to succeed on grade level work. So we found that in our CERN report that students in high poverty schools, majority Black, Latinx, and Indigenous student populations were significantly more likely to be remediated than their white and wealthier counterparts, even when their level of struggle is identical. So again, just to reiterate that, students in low-income, non-white majority classrooms are more likely to be heavily remediated than their white high-income counterparts, despite similar levels of readiness. With that said, though, and what we found, and it's most important, is that when students who traditionally receive remediation were provided with accelerated learning practices and approaches, they mastered nearly 50% more grade level lessons than those students who were in classrooms that took on a remediation approach to learning. So while we know that this approach works and that it's beneficial for students who are English learners or who have learning and thinking differences, we also know that oftentimes, despite the best of intentions, planning for scaffolding and differentiation for our students with unique or diverse needs can unfortunately feel like an additional task that we may run out of time for. And it may feel more efficient to quote unquote, teach down the middle. And if you've joined us for a previous session, you may have heard the research that we've shared that debunks this idea of a mythical average student, and it critiques this approach of teaching down the middle and instead favors an approach that accounts for scaffolding and differentiation. We're not going to review that research today. However, we do want to acknowledge that for some, possibly many, educators, planning to accelerate learning with these practices like scaffolding will be a shift. So what will it take to ensure that students experience learning acceleration? Well, first, we want to make sure that we're acknowledging learner variability and going beyond labels of students and assuming that that's an automatic indication of what students can or cannot do, meaning that our instruction is instead driven by data and evidence of student work. You want to make the next one as well? Thanks, Katie. We also want to make sure that we're providing strong core instruction that, again, accounts for that natural learner variability and those unique needs, whether it be something from a student's IEP accommodations or supports that attend to English language development. And then finally, we want to provide instruction that operates from the standpoint that with the right supports, all learners can access grade level learning. I'm going to pause here and just ask you to reread and digest some of this information and reflect on what you notice about what we've pointed out here, and then to share your reflections in the chat. And as you're having those reflections, for the sake of time, we're going to keep moving to make sure we get through the most we can today. Actually, could you go back one more, Katie? Thank you. So what I hope you're noticing or is coming through is that we're talking about tier 1 core instruction and how students are being provided supports to access that core instruction, not talking about scaffolds or modifications that may come in during a tier 2 or tier 3 support, but really what we're looking at today is how are we supporting students with tier 1 instruction. And so we're going to take a little bit of time to go into breakout groups to discuss what are some of the key messages that you've heard so far that you plan to bring back to your staff about learning acceleration for all students. And then think about why is that particular key message important for your staff to hear and begin to embrace if they have not already. Just as a reminder, this deck is in your handout. So when you're thinking about those key messages, I know we're going a little bit quickly, feel free to refer back to the slide deck. But right now, again, we're thinking about key messages that we'd like to bring back to our staff. And we're going to go ahead and go into breakouts for about 3 minutes. Great. I think we're all back in the room, and I noticed the majority of us did this, but if you could wait for the Zoom timer to bring you back so we can all come back together at the same time, it ensures that everyone gets a chance to share their ideas and be heard. With that, I want to go ahead and give a moment for a few of us to hear from some of your colleagues. So Kendra, we'd love to hear from you and what you shared with your group.
Hi, everybody. So our group really focused on the fact that teachers need to have high expectations for all students, all meaning all students, and that it's okay for the struggle in learning to be difficult. Obviously, nobody ever said that it was easy. And it's our job as teachers to support students in that process. But by having the high expectations and building student confidence in themselves really helps the process.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Kendra. And I know in several groups, and I saw in the chat, Jody, thank you for your comment about mindsets. It's really a key component to ensuring that students have access to grade level instruction. And keeping with that idea of mindsets, I'd love to hear from Jen as well, from Donna's group.
Yes. So I work with the statewide system support office at DESE. So I support 5 different districts right now. And I think the idea of shifting mindsets has really been kind of core for all of our conversations this year. And really, I think some of it, what I was trying to say that now I've thought of the better word for it is there is some unlearning that needs to be done. I think that it's not just, changing what you thought you knew, but also changing how you might have been educated in some ways of how to teach or what it means, what best practices are. So I think that unlearning is a big piece of it. And the charts that we've shown so far that kind of give you what some of the unlearning is like that will be really helpful. As well as I mentioned that the first bullet point around changing, using these predetermined labels that we have as indicators of what a student can or cannot do. I feel like is number one that I feel like has been really at the core of all of those conversations and all of that unlearning.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jen, for this, and great conversations all around the mindset shifts that are going to need to happen. We know that always time is a challenge, and these changes do take time. That might require a re-examination of priorities. And just like Jen said, a bit of unlearning and sharing some of this information that we've gone through just in these only 3 or 4 slides. But with that, we're going to keep moving and get to our second objective here. So again, right now we're going to spend some time looking at an approach to scaffolding that looks at 3 priority areas for how teachers can go about more intentionally planning for scaffolds by looking at their content area, their learning context in general, and students' needs. So just to get ourselves warmed up to discuss and to bring to the surface what we already know about scaffolds, in the chat, we'd love for you to share how you define scaffolding. And no need for a fancy definition. If you'd like to just complete the sentence, scaffolding is or scaffolding is not, we'd love to know what previous schema you're bringing in today. Thanks for getting us started. Strategic supports. All right. These are some great ideas. Some maybe you haven't considered before, or maybe they're challenging your preconceived ideas. Throughout the rest of our session today, I really encourage you to think about what is being affirmed in what we're sharing with you, and maybe what is being challenged and what learning might need to shift. So thank you all for those ideas that you have gotten us started with. But let's go ahead and talk about how we're approaching it. So what we go over may be a little bit different from how you're used to talking about scaffolds. Our goal today is to really move beyond simply offering a discrete list of scaffolds or a bank of video models, and instead move your practice or your teacher's practice by diving more into that thinking that goes behind selecting and designing strong scaffolds for any content area. So our exploration of strong instructional scaffolding begins by recognizing that scaffolding is both a noun, so that observable thing, you can see some there, and it's also a verb, so scaffolding as an intentional action in the planning process and implementation. So the table on your screen offers a simple definition and explanation of the critical features of the noun form. And I'm going to ask my colleague Katie if you could just read that definition in the blue box for the group out loud.
Yes. Instructional scaffolding as a noun. A temporary student-specific support structure designed to maximize access to grade level concepts and tasks.
Thanks, Katie. We're going to break that down a little bit further by looking at the critical features of scaffolds in their noun form. So in their noun form, scaffolds take on a specific structure, take on one of many different forms, whether it's an instructional tool. So these are things like graphic organizers, your sentence starters, concept maps, anchor charts, and so on. The structure might be a peer interaction. So any kind of collaborative structure where students are engaging in collaborative conversations. It might be a teacher interaction. So a teacher may have scaffolded and sequenced questions in order to advance a student's comprehension of a text. And the structure might just be exercises that have become routine in your classroom, like a visualization strategy or something similar. These scaffolds must also be student specific. So they are responding to evidence and not an assumption about an individual student's needs or what assets they bring to the classroom, but they are specific to what we know and what's been evidenced by the students' previous performance. And in the chat, I saw many people called out that scaffolds are also temporary. They're meant to be removed. And they're removed so that we can also make sure that we have fostered independent learning. Later on today, we're going to take a look at an example, and we're going to ask ourselves, if this scaffold was to be removed, would the student be able to independently complete the task? Has the scaffold prepared them in such a way to foster that independent learning? They must also be grade level and support the student with building that competence and confidence with attempting grade level content. And finally, we want to make sure that scaffolds are maximizing students' time grappling productively with complex grade level content. In our previous session, we talked about the difference between minimizing or stripping away the difficulty of a task while maintaining the complexity. So that, again, is related to our also our approach of scaffolding, where we want to make sure students have that opportunity to still grapple with complex grade level work. So what's important to note here is that educators often stop here at this noun level when thinking about scaffolding. And we find that they typically also only attend to the structure criteria. This is evidenced and fostered by the exhaustive banks of scaffolding strategies in the field today. We even have provided you all with a hefty packet of scaffolding strategies through one of the links in the handout today. With that said, we continue to hear educators say that they struggle with implementing these strategies and structures effectively, or that the strategies just don't work. We continue to hear requests, though, for more banks and more examples of strategies specific to a particular curriculum or group of students or content area. So while undoubtedly these lists, banks, one-pagers are helpful in the scaffolding design process, we have to also remember that they are limited in terms of improving our teachers' practice with scaffolding and thus improving student outcomes. So we're going to take a quick look at what some of these resources that I'm mentioning might look like and see if we can pull out what makes them a useful resource to provide to teachers for lesson preparation and why they might also be less than useful. So here is a list or a one-pager you may have actually seen before. It comes from WIDA, and it outlines the typical and effective supports for multilingual learners. And it's very appealing. I see it used all the time in trainings for supporting multilingual learners with scaffolds. But taking a look at this list that we usually give teachers to satisfy that ask for the one-pager or educators, what might be some of the pitfalls of approaching scaffolding and improving your practice this way? Thanks, Laura and Mitchell, for getting us started. Oh yes, I'm seeing lots of great ideas coming through, even though this is just such the approach we often see teachers take. They have a bank and they're asked to just choose something that's going to provide support. But as you all have pointed out, it's very limited in that it's a one-size-fits-all. It doesn't explain when or why to use certain scaffolds we see here. We also know that certain of these scaffolds need to be scaffolded for students because they require other skills necessary to access them. Yes, it could be used as a checklist. Thanks for that, Spencer. So oftentimes teachers are left asking themselves, when do I use these? How do I know if I need to use these? Who are these best suited for? What proficiency level, and so on. That's really great responses in the chat. I encourage you to take a look if you haven't seen, but we're going to go to another example, just take one more look. So this is an example of an academic language toolkit. It's another type of scaffolding support often provided to teachers looking to build their skills around scaffolding for English learners. And it is an excellent resource. However, like the last one we looked at, it has many of the pitfalls that you all have called out. It does not provide a structure for teachers to know when students should use these starters, when to engage with them. Oftentimes, we see teachers are provided with these resources that eventually turn into, for example, a placemat for students to reference on their own, and it's not really being used effectively. It needs more structure to it. So what we're starting to hopefully pull out here is that providing teachers with these resources or providing even video models, while useful, it's an incomplete and unsustainable approach to strengthening how they're designing and implementing scaffolds. We're leaving out some pieces, specifically a few you all have already highlighted, and we're going to take a closer look at that in our next section. So speaking about what is being left out, I'd love to see in the chat a bit more from you all, even though I see you've provided some already, around how we can more intentionally use this wide variety of scaffolding tools and strategies that we come across in a variety of trainings. So you could share in the chat, we'd love to hear from you. Great, so I see some ideas coming through. We want to also, in addition to thinking about how and when we're using these for different subject or grade levels, or if we're modeling them, we want to think about how we are supporting teachers in a sustainable way so that they're not reliant on what is their bank of scaffolds or what videos they have seen and hoping that that transfers. So let's take a look at how we can become a bit more intentional. This brings us to our expanded definition of scaffolding in its verb form. As an intentional practice that takes into consideration these three key factors: the content, the student, and the context. So this action-oriented definition necessitates a level of critical planning and reflection that's often lost when we're limiting ourselves to just thinking about scaffolds in the way we just looked at them. So what we want to do is to take our toolbox of scaffolds and apply them more intentionally using these three priority areas. And how we do that requires pedagogical content knowledge, a deep understanding of students, and reflective practices that attend to the interplay of the three. So we want to shift away from general questions about what is a good scaffold for this lesson, or how do I scaffold for X? Instead, we want to move towards asking more precise and contextual questions that answer more specifically how we can scaffold. So for example, instead of saying, how do I scaffold word problems for my students with IEPs? We're often here at TNTP asked for one-pagers on scaffolds for students with special needs. So instead of that question, we need to recognize that it depends on the learning target, the student's specific assets, their needs, and many other factors. So we should be moving towards questions like, how do I scaffold word problems for my students who are still working on decoding and currently guessing at unfamiliar words? So we're going to unpack this a bit more. So what we're going to do now is take a look at 3 one-pagers that unpack each of these 3 areas with critical questions and action steps and a few helpful tips and tools that teachers should be using when planning for designing and implementing scaffolds. So each one attends to either the content, the context, or the students. And what we're going to do is I'm going to ask that you take about 5 minutes to read through these 3, and then we're going to come back together to discuss them. As you are thinking about these 3 areas and reading, I'd like for you to think about where you or your teachers have the greatest strengths. Maybe it's in attending to the student need, maybe it's in attending to content, and then also think, what area is there a critical gap for you and your teachers? And again, like I said, we'll come back together. You can find these slides again in the deck that's been shared, and Margaret is also going to share again the link that has these slides in them. So let's go ahead, and if you're having trouble finding the slides, just let us know, but we're going to take about 5 minutes to independently read these 3 slides, and think about our strengths and areas that might be a gap. All right, welcome back, everyone. I was hearing great conversations throughout about different areas that we can begin shifting and talking about. And before I turn it over to you all, I just want to highlight one element that I heard in a couple groups about not being exactly sure what you need in order to address the gap. And with that said, I want to reiterate that what we're sharing with you in these one-pagers are tools we hope that you'll bring back to teachers. So it might be that during your collaborative planning, teachers are using one of these one-pagers to attend to one or two of these questions that they haven't been asking themselves yet. Just like we said, this shift takes time, and we're not going to, bring in these 3 slides and immediately start changing our scaffolding approach, in day 1. But it might be, we've been really attending to content and talking about content. Let's look at a couple of these questions from how can we better attend to our students or leverage our context and begin addressing these shifts incrementally. With that said, I do want to turn it over to you all to share out. If you'd like to share, we'd love for you to put your name in the chat so we can call on a few people to share some of their takeaways. And I hope it's all right. I'm actually going to volunteer Linda from one of the groups I stepped in. I think she had some great insights about what she noticed in the questions.
You realize this is never going to come out the same way twice.
No problem.
What stood out to me was trying to look at the goal of what you were working on and have the past and future lessons somehow connect. Think about teaching as that kind of, evolution as opposed to in isolation, and to understand your materials, not just as a handout, but is there a purpose to them? Instead of just typically getting together and, oh, we'll do this first and we'll do this next, and picking out pages, what's appropriate, what's necessary, what's even more necessary for one student over another. And to try to build on what students know. I see this a lot, believe it or not, in the preschool. It could even come from pictures. What do you see? What does that make you think of? How does that connect? How does it make you feel? And so building on what kids know from guiding questions.
Linda, that was perfectly, very well stated. And I appreciate, you sharing those takeaways with your colleagues. I'd love to hear from a few more people. I got a message that Amanda from Jacob's group, you might be willing to share with our group today. Who's Amanda? Jacob, maybe you could highlight for us some of what you heard in your group.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about how we are seeing patterns of how one approach for all has really been commonly happening, and how even with when people think of scaffolds, they were predominantly think of special ed students, and so then we started thinking about how do we address that. And so Amanda made a great point of, well, what if we looked at the reading levels and we incorporated that into classrooms, we could see that there's different access points needed for a variety of different levels of readers. Kendra also went on and shared how they were doing some of that work with math and taking their diagnostics using that to build out modules for different levels of learners. So that we heard a couple of great ideas in our group.
That's great, Jacob. And everything that you just shared, those things take time. Again, they might take a re-examination of priorities and how we're spending our planning time, or how teachers are spending their planning time. But it's sounding like, at least the group that got to share, that they're finding this is worth that investment in taking those shifts. So thank you all for sharing that out. In our next section, we're going to look at how we can now bring together these ideas we've been talking about, having that nice robust bank of scaffolds, building that, for helping teachers build that, but also how they think about these considerations to make sure they're being intentional. So we're going to watch a video from an 8th grade science classroom. And as we're watching the video, you're going to be thinking about how the teacher is scaffolding in a way that maintains rigor. What are the considerations that he may have made when it comes to the content, the context, and students? And then again, just logistically, what might it take to plan in the way that he planned for this lesson? This classroom is a very diverse group with students of different literacy levels, different English language proficiency levels, and you'll see that come through both in seeing the students and his explanations. Katie, could you go to the next slide for just one moment? So again, as we watch the video, we want to note, what scaffolds do we observe? Think about what considerations we think this teacher might have made based on those 3 areas. And then also, how did this approach maintain the rigor of the lesson and learning objective? And with that, we're going to go ahead and share the video.
All right, good morning. Can I have your attention at the agenda, please? Here is what we're going to do today. We're still working on this target that says I can explain how magnets and wires work together.
In Peter Hill's 8th grade science class, students are spending their second day with a complex scientific article. Yesterday, the students began the process of reading the article. Today, they're making deeper meaning of what they've read.
I decided to start the class with a pre-assessment. I think whenever you can work with data with kids in real time, it just boosts engagement and kids get interested. So what I did is I created a little 10-question quiz using an online app called Socrative. Hey, so this is really interesting. My side of the app tells me which questions you struggled with the most. Question number 3, which was about the difference between volts and amps, only 38% of people got it right. Question number 4, only 31% of people got it right. Question 7, only 50% of people got it right. So that tells me our kind of areas of weakness are that section from the text about current electricity.
If you learn something and you test yourself on it, you know what you're going to focus on and what you need to learn more about and what you need to improve on. So knowing what you don't know helps with what you're going to learn.
I knew the ones that I got wrong, I had to look out for, and I had to make sure that I knew them. And the ones that I got right, I knew that I had them down and I didn't really need to focus on them anymore, that I could focus on other things.
So now we're going to work in teams to get everybody up to a high level of understanding on this text. And the way we're going to do that is through this activity called content categorization. So I think if kids are going to make sense of complex texts, you need to ask them at the end of reading it to do some complex thinking. And I think one higher level piece of thinking that we encourage kids to do a lot in a classroom is to categorize information and prioritize information. Take a look up front at the center board. Here's what's going to happen. Each team is going to get assigned one category from that reading.
Working in small groups, the students discuss an assigned category from the reading. Their task? Prioritize and record 2 important pieces of information from this category.
What would you say?
I said static electricity is when there's a multitude of
electrons on a circle.
Each group contributes their own prioritized ideas and rotates to a new table that covers a new category.
When you get to your new station, read the information that's there, and then compare it to what you have in your notes, and prioritize what you think are the next two most important pieces of information, and add those to the list. If there's anything on that list then that you don't have in your notes, add it to your notes.
Electrons are everywhere.
There are two types of electric energy, static and current.
When you move a magnet over a wire, electricity is generated.
Let's look back in the article because I think I wrote all of that in my notes.
Yeah.
Is the north pole of a magnet attracted to the south pole?
Of the other magnet.
The south pole or the north pole of the other magnet?
The south pole.
So why don't we just write a definition for electrons and say electrons are small particles that produce...
That can generate electricity.
When kids are working in small groups, discussing the text that they just read, thinking about what they think is the most important information, things like that, it does a lot of things. First of all, it levels the playing field. Those kids that might have missed something in the text, they get a chance to, in a safe environment, in a small group, hear it from their peers and add it to their notes. At the same time, it allows kids to do some higher level things like make connections between bits of information.
We're going to do a quick switch. I apologize. That was a helpful video, but not actually the date. That was day 2. So I'm going to go to day 1 so that you all can see how this started. I apologize for that.
If you remember from last week's experiment, this thing, if you spin it, it generates electricity.
In Peter Hill's 8th grade science class, students are learning to read and think like scientists. Closely reading a complex scientific article, they are developing a conceptual understanding of how electricity works.
Talking to a scientist once, and he said, look, my job is 10% experimenting, 40% writing, and 50% reading. So I want kids to kind of have a middle school version of that experience in my classroom. Basically today, we're going to read a really complicated article that explains why moving magnets over wires makes electricity. All of this stuff is focused on this target. I can explain how magnets and wires work together to affect electrical energy. So today we're going to learn the why. I had a pretty complex text that I wanted the kids to dive into. It had complex vocabulary, complex concepts, and a lot of the concepts were abstract. We're talking about things like atoms that nobody's ever seen before. So we needed to find ways for the kids to really tackle that complex text. The first thing we're going to do is a pre-reading activity. Before we even start the article, you're going to work in teams to do this activity that we call GPS. Does anybody know what GPS stands for? Eve?
Global Positioning System?
It does for most scientists. For us, it's standing for something much more basic: glue, paper, and scissors. All right, so you'll see what that... Before we started reading, we looked at the vocabulary that was going to turn up in the text. I took the text that you're about to read and I took out all the key vocabulary words. I sliced them up into individual little tags. With your teams, you're going to take apart those tags, you're going to spread them out, and you're going to talk about the words. You're going to organize them on that blue piece of paper in a way that makes sense to your team.
Are we going to do sentences? Yeah. So maybe like all the types
Let's
of
do like a
energy.
mind lab. Maybe we should have like what it is on one side and like the
We have a heterogeneous class with readers from all over the world and at all different levels. The value in that activity is the kids sitting together and talking about the words and just having those in the forefront of their mind so that we can transition right into reading the text.
What about conduction? 2 words that I was struggling with were induction and conduction.
Do you remember the video you guys watched about Tesla?
Yeah.
He invented the induction motor.
During the activity, it helped me know which one is which.
Like, what does a train conductor do?
He controls the train to where it should go.
Yeah, so there's an element of movement usually involved.
And how they interact with electricity.
It's like causing something to happen, making some movement. So that, you can probably think about how that relates to electrons. We're going to actually tackle the article now. So you have a choice to make about how you want to read this article. This one, which is the article in the separate note catcher. If you feel like this stuff is totally brand new to you and the categorization might be difficult, grab this one, which has
the note catcher kind of embedded right in the text?
We think it's important that all kids read the same text. We just had different options for how the text was formatted.
Peter came to me before this lesson and said, you know, I want to use this particular reading about electricity, but I'm concerned that it might not be accessible, especially for some of our English language learners. So he took me through the article and the note catcher that he designed.
We found a way to chunk out the text and embed some note catchers and sentence starters in those note catchers. So students that are struggling with reading or students that are learning English could access that difficult text, but with just some scaffolds built in so that they could still be successful.
I chose an article that had a sheet and then an extra note catcher attached to it. And I tend to write a lot, and by having that extra space, it makes me want to write more and have more detail in it.
I chose one that would suit me best on my level of the topic electricity. And the one I chose had a vocabulary section and a section where you can take notes.
One thing that's hard for students is moving back and forth between the text and the notes. I took the note catcher and divided it along the same headings as the article. Guiding them in that movement from the article to the note catcher and back helps them keep track of their thinking as they read.
I'm going to read the first paragraph out loud. And then at the end of the paragraph, I'm going to ask you to do a cat P on the page. Because remember, cat P is the strategy we're going to use to keep ourselves focused while we're reading. We have a classroom strategy that we use all year long, and what kids do is, as they're reading, they code the text in one of 4 ways. They could make a connection to something they know, they could ask a question, they could translate the information into their own words, or they could predict what's going to happen next in the text. So we affectionately call that cat P. Flip a switch, turn a knob, plug in a battery, press a power button. All of these actions turn on the electrical devices that we use each day.
When someone reads the text, rather than focusing on reading, you can actually focus on what it's actually saying and what it means.
I think it's important for kids to hear difficult things read with the proper inflection and read well. That gives them an opportunity to hear the words and to hear the cadence and the sentence structure.
Since everything in the universe is made of atoms, everything in the universe also contains electrons. Okay, write down what you're thinking right now. Okay, lean across the table, talk to the person that you're facing, and have a conversation with them about what you were thinking when you read that paragraph.
I said everything in the universe contains electrons.
I said electricity is based off of electrons.
I did connection and I said if 2 electrons touch each other, they produce electricity.
So as the year goes on and kids become more comfortable with this close reading strategy, that frees me up to go around and check in with kids.
If you just rush through a text, then you wouldn't understand anything about it. But if you read it carefully and you use cat P, then you can you would understand and you would know what's going on in the text.
I think you've got what you need to be able to tackle this at home. We're going to use it for a group activity tomorrow. So put that in the same place so we can get done.
Thanks for bearing with us, everyone, on the video switch. Hopefully that you were still able to follow. I'm just gonna give you a second to get back to our slides. Great. So we saw many, many different types of scaffolding strategies used in that video. And before we go into breakout groups, I just want to make sure that we have a shared understanding of what are some of the scaffolds that you observed in the video. And then we'll go into breakouts to discuss a little bit, more about the consideration. So if you could put in the chat, what were some of the scaffolds you observed used in this lesson? Cat P is always the first one that comes up, always gets a few chuckles. Yes. Yep. Great, thanks for those that have entered that nice long list. From Mark we have there. Yep, Spencer, pre-assessments. Kelly, you got the scaffolds within the complex article, and we can even break that down even more into how that was scaffolded. Great, so going to just go ahead and show our list of the scaffolds that we caught when we saw when we watched the video. So just as you all pointed out, there were chunked text, pre-assessment, the teacher read aloud, there were embedded graphic organizers, vocabulary, scaffolded questions. We saw at the beginning they were doing some schematic mapping activities to negotiate the meaning of new words. We saw that students were grouped heterogeneously, and I'm sure there were many others that we did not get to see, or maybe that you noticed. So right now we're going to go into breakout groups to again bring together these two ideas that we're working on, having our different scaffolding strategies, but coupling that with thinking about the different considerations. And I know, we don't know this teacher student, so we're going to have to do a little bit of assuming, but we'd like for you all to now think about what are some of the considerations this teacher may have made. Feel free to look back at the one-pagers, those 3 one-pagers we've provided you with, to think about what considerations were made and how they maintained the rigor of the lesson. We're going to go into breakouts for about 5 minutes to discuss. Welcome back, everyone. And I heard some really great conversations that I was able to jump around to. And I think there are some, reflections or revelations or insights, whatever you'd like to call them, coming up about, what does this mean for our scheduling? What does this mean for planning? Other priorities that we have. And I think it's great that, we're beginning to think about that and not just about scaffolding in an isolated context, but in more context. How are we coaching teachers? How are we supporting new teachers with this? So love to hear again from any of our other colleagues who'd like to share out. Feel free to come off mute, put your name in the chat if you'd like to share.
Matt or Mark, do you guys want to jump in? Because you had some awesome insights I got really excited about right off the bat.
Sure, I'll jump in. Oh, go ahead.
No, Mark, it's all yours.
Thanks. And actually, we as a group, we were really spot on. I thought that background knowledge is so important, and I think the teacher really recognized that and spent the time to access that background knowledge. And also understanding that vocabulary is so important. He gave a lot of really good tools and opportunities for the students to really access the vocabulary. And then Matt came up with one thing that was really important, the fact that he read to them, so that allowed, again, all the students to really be able to access the content and to participate. So those were the big takeaways we had.
Yeah, so if I can just jump on that latter point was about that he didn't necessarily expect all his students to be proficient with the foundational reading skills, and he provided them the opportunity to actually engage in the concepts where he could bring along their oral comprehension and know that maybe down the hallway they'd be learning those foundational decoding skills, and really centered on the work at hand, the content at hand, and didn't let the text get in the way of the learning.
Great, thanks for sharing those points out and highlighting how important academic vocabulary is. I'm going to take a second to plug that our next session will be on vocabulary. So hopefully you're seeing how these different pieces are tying together. We'd love to hear from Shannon Gardner and some of your insights.
Shannon, I was hoping you could share your last point about what students could do with this outside of the class.
Thanks, Craig.
Yeah, we were talking about all the different scaffolds and the layered scaffolds that he was doing. And I've just mentioned that one of the most interesting points was at the end when he said, well, it looks like you guys can be doing some of this at home. And I feel like it's all the access points that he gave them in the routines of using some of those scaffolds, that they can take it back, they can work on, they can do their reflections and come back to class and talk about it. And he's provided all that scaffolding so that it can move on. That difficult content isn't just going to get passed by the students. They have a routine to really dig into it. Absolutely, and those varied entry points is a huge part of that. So thanks for highlighting that for us, Shannon. And we're going to actually close out this session. You all have provided great insights that I think everyone has benefited from hearing. And I want to make sure to just have a chance to point you to a few more resources. Katie, could you go to the next slide? Great. So again, you have all of these resources with you, and some of you have been asking about professional learning and bringing this back to your school. We have a few more resources for you to consider with teachers about things you might stop and start or continue when it comes to how you're planning for scaffolds and what you're prioritizing in, like we said, small shifts, because this takes time. We've also included an additional video similar to the one we just watched, the similar activity. So we have the video as well as the same graphic organizer we just looked at for teachers to be able to watch the video, identify the scaffolds and considerations. And in the video, the answer key, I guess you could say, is highlighted within. So you'll be able to see that there. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Katie to guide us through a little bit more about designing.
Great, thank you, Irene. So now that we've talked about just what a strong scaffold is, and we've seen an example in action, we'd love to talk a bit more about how you can design effective scaffolds. And specifically, we'll dig into how exactly to consider the content, your students, and the context during the planning process. And so, as I shared in the previous section, whenever teachers are designing scaffolds, they'll want to start by really deeply understanding the grade level content. And specifically, they can ask themselves, what grade level understandings are students expected to learn and demonstrate? So let's say, for example, a teacher wanted students to master this 4th grade task. A rectangular porch is 4 feet wide. It is 3 times as long as it is wide. Find the perimeter of the porch. So this problem is aligned to standard 4OA-A2, and the learning goal of this task is really for students to understand multiplicative comparisons. And so here's the language of the standard. So I'll give you a moment to just read through that language in this box at the bottom of the slide. And so would love to hear, as you look at the language of this standard, go ahead and put in the chat, what words represent the no? So what students should understand? And what words represent the show? What students should be able to do? Put your thoughts in the chat. Again, what would you want students to know? And what would you want students to show based on this standard? Great, thank you, Eileen. So students will need to know how to multiply and divide. Great, no rectangular perimeter, yep, and perimeter, maybe porch, yep, that's a good thought. Need to understand perimeter, great. So for this task, distinguishing multiplicative comparison from additive comparison is the no, or what students should understand. And specifically, multiplying to get a length that is 3 times longer than the width is the show. So if I were this teacher, I would know that I want students grappling with the multiplicative compare aspect of the standard when they are doing this task. And as teachers are still kind of understanding the content, part of that understanding is also considering what prerequisite knowledge and skills are needed in order to access the new learning. And so we can use the DESE Navigator tool to map the 4th grade standard. And so we see here that this 4th grade standard maps back to 3OA-A3. And so here's the language of that standard. Use multiplication and division within 100 to solve word problems in situations involving equal groups, arrays, and measurement quantities. By looking at this task, we also know that students need to understand perimeter. I saw a lot of folks put that in the chat as well. And that is part of standard 3MDD8, solving real world and mathematical problems involving perimeter of polygons. So we've started with a deep understanding of the content by looking at the current grade understanding that we really want students to master with this task, and by thinking about the previous grade understanding that students will need in order to access it. So now let's think about what we know about these students. So to consider what we know about our students, we'll ask ourselves, what does an analysis of student work and other data specifically tell us about what they know or don't know yet? And so in this example, the teacher has collected data from a pre-assessment along with data from their daily lesson practice. And so based on the data, a couple things have become clear. Nearly 100% of the students consistently use multiplication within 100 to solve word problems by using drawings, equations, and measurement. So students are really showing proficiency with that standard 3 OA A3. However, only 15% of students demonstrated understanding of finding the perimeter of a rectangle. Most students were applying the area formula instead. So now that we've thought about the students, we can consider that last piece of the triad, the context. And so to consider the context, teachers can ask themselves this question: what resources and tools within the learning environment can be leveraged to support students' learning? What barrier may exist that hinders the students' learning? And so in this classroom, as the teacher considered the context, they noticed that a key feature of the learning environment is this visually rich academic word wall. And students are just beginning to develop the habit of referencing it independently when they need reminders of the meaning of mathematical language and concepts. So now that we've considered the content and the students and the context, let's look at a couple possible scaffolds to determine whether or not they are appropriate. So here is a potential scaffold. The teacher provides a tape diagram in an effort to help students make sense of the word problem. So the question for us is this an effective scaffold for this lesson and these students? Why or why not? And I'll give you some time to think about this and then put your thoughts in the chat. Thinking about this lesson and these students, would this be an effective scaffold? And this is a brave space, so it's totally fine if you just put your thoughts in the chat. We're all learning here. So feel free to share whatever you think. Thanks, Spencer, for getting us started. And Mitchell, thank you for sharing that. Thanks, Candace. Great. Great. Okay, so a lot of you have added or have shared that this is not effective. And so while this tape diagram may help get students to the answer more quickly, it isn't actually effective for this task. It isn't setting them up to grapple with making sense of the multiplicative aspect of the word problem, which is a key part of the standard and something that we want students to grapple with on their own. And as some of you mentioned in the chat, it hasn't minimized the barrier of understanding perimeter, which we know from the students' pre-assessments was a key thing that students struggled with. Now, one thing to note is that this doesn't mean that tape diagrams in and of themselves are ineffective scaffolds. They might be a perfectly fine scaffold in a different context or with different students, but it's just not the most effective scaffold for these students and this content. So let's take a look at another one. So here's option number 2. So to scaffold this task, the teacher provides a definition of perimeter using a visual that is added to the classroom word wall. And students are encouraged to visit the word wall if they need to recall the meaning of perimeter while they work. And so, same question, would love to hear if this is an effective scaffold for this lesson and these students, and why or why not. And you can just go ahead and put some thoughts in the chat. Great, thank you, Lynn. All right, so we would argue that this scaffold is effective. It supports students with a prerequisite skill that they'll need in order to tackle this problem. And importantly, it's also a skill that we have data to show that students need some scaffolding and need some support around perimeter. Additionally, it's responsive to the context of the classroom. There is already a word wall in the class and students are getting accustomed to using it. And finally, it does not lower the rigor of the standard, which is really about multiplicative compare. It just supports students to access that problem so that they can do the really rigorous thinking around multiplicative compare and solve this problem correctly. So would love to just give you a moment to kind of reflect on that model. What key takeaways did you have from reviewing the model and what questions do you still have? And so you can put either question in the chat, either answer to those questions in the chat, and I'll give you some time just to capture those in the chat. Great, thank you, Spencer. It all hangs together, absolutely. Knowing student current understanding, knowing standards mapping, and then applying it to the context. It's great. And thank you, Laura. The importance of considering prerequisite skills while remembering the target skill, absolutely, in order to support without lowering rigor. That is such a key point. Thank you so much for elevating that. Teachers have to unpack the standards to help determine the scaffolds, absolutely. So thinking about that content really deeply in order to determine what would be appropriate. And it looks like still some questions regarding effective approaches, including varying scaffolds in early elementary, where behaviors and variable prior school experiences are so challenging. Thank you for sharing that. Great. Well, thank you all so much for those reflections and those questions. So we are about to wrap up here. And so we have gone through these 3 objectives. We've talked a little bit about how learning acceleration supports students with diverse learning needs. We have internalized a best practice for intentionally planning scaffolding strategies according to content area, learning context, and students' needs. And then we've thought a bit about how to design scaffolds and how to ask those questions that will help us attend to all those different pieces that, as Spencer said, really hang together. And so we're now going to move into some work time. We'll spend some time doing some thinking about how to support teachers with planning effective scaffolds. And so to do that, we'll ask that you consider one of the 4 leader levers that leaders have at their disposal to ensure that they can systematize change. So when we think about those levers, we think about expectations, tools, support, and time. So for example, what are the precise expectations of adults and or students? What are the expectations around scaffolding that you might want to put in place? What are the tools? What tools will adults or students need to meet the expectation? Will they need documents, technology, text? And what's the support they need? What support or development do adults or students need to implement the system? Do they need PD, training, reading, or coaching? And finally, what time will adults and or students need to learn and refine implementation? How can you adjust time to provide what is needed when it is needed? So we wanted to give you some time to just individually reflect on the expectations, tools, supports, and time that you might want to provide to teachers in order to help them effectively scaffold. So we'll give you just a few minutes now to do some individual reflection. All right, so I'd love to invite you all back. I know that there's a lot of thinking that you could do around these 4 levers, so that was not enough, but hopefully started to get the wheels turning a little bit. Although I know you've been talking about these things throughout the session, so I think they're already turning, but we'd love to just hear out. Does anyone have anything they would like to share with the group just around some expectations that you want to provide, or tools or support or time? Would love to just elevate any ideas in the room for how you all are thinking about taking this information and sharing with your teachers or your leaders. Great, great. Thank you, Mitchell and Candace. Candace, would love if you don't mind coming off mute and just voicing over a little bit about what you put in the chat.
So I teach middle school math and science, and there's just a little bit of we have a lot of new teachers in our district, and they're really just not seeing the flow of the standards, what's in a standard, what's unpacking it. They're looking at an MCAS question and teaching to an MCAS question, even though we have, highly designed, high quality products. We have Carnegie Learning, and it's just really teaching them, how is this, connected to the standard? What are the prerequisites? How do you unpack it? They're either over teaching or under teaching. So trying to teach a strategy for how to do that process.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. And I think really knowing the standards can also really help teachers ask that question: what's a scaffold that will help me to provide access, but will not lower the rigor? And so knowing exactly what the meat around the standards is so key. Thank you so much for sharing that. Great. And then let's see, Timothy, would you mind just sharing what you put in the chat?
Sure. I work in a high school, and we've got such a push towards grade level instruction and rigor. I think a lot of teachers are thinking about the content and trying to get students to engage and make that content relevant. And I don't think we're doing enough of thinking about all of the prerequisite skills that are necessary to engage in the conceptualization of some of these things, but also in the breaking down of texts in some of those prerequisite skills. It's just not something that's on teachers' radar, and we need to do a better job of that.
That's great. Thanks so much for sharing that, Timothy. And I think that is such a key piece of this too. Knowing what the prerequisite skills are and where students are in relation to their mastery of those skills will really help teachers develop some strong scaffolds. So that's great. All right. So we are coming up against time, and we want to make sure that you have plenty of time to provide some feedback on this session. We pour over that feedback and we make changes based on it. So we would love, if you wouldn't mind, just taking a couple minutes to share that feedback. The link is in the chat. And just so that you have our information, here it is on the slide. Feel free to reach out to us, to email us. Of course, follow TNTP on any social media platforms, but we're always happy to talk more about this, to answer any questions that you still have. So feel free to reach out via email to me or to Irene. And again, if you wouldn't mind taking that survey, we would so appreciate it. But thank you all so much for your time. We know that it is a very, very busy time of year, and we just so appreciate you being here and your thoughtfulness and your engagement. So thank you. We'll stay on in case anyone has any particular questions, but and feel free to take the survey before logging off, or if you need to log off, then you can take the survey after. That's great too.